What I want to give you first of all is just a survey, a broad survey of what's happening in some of the key bioethics issues. And I think we have to start with abortion because that's really where it all started. And the stats are really quite amazing here, but most authorities would accept that there are somewhere around 43 million abortions every year in the world. 43 million. Now think about the populations of your own countries. But if I told you that there were 57 million deaths from all other causes, cancer, heart disease, accidents, everything else, 57 million people die every year in the world. And on top of that, there are 43 million unborn children. So almost half of all human deaths are babies who have their lives ended by doctors or others in the womb. It's stunning. And it has had effect. So this is the map of the world. The redder it is, the more legal abortion is, particularly legal in China where there is forced abortion. And you'll see about 80% of the world's countries now have abortion as legal. And it's only really in South America and Africa where it is not legal to the same extent. These are the figures in different countries in the world. So we start with time at the left of the graph in 1920, and it goes up to 2010. And what you need to appreciate from this is that legalized abortion on a massive scale is a relatively recent phenomenon in world history. It only really started in the 40s, 50s, and 60s of last century. Very, very recent. And of these blocks you see, the top one there in orange is China. And the next block is the former Soviet Union, which you see splits into Russia and the independent states at about 1990. And then you've got the other groupings. Yellow is the rest of Asia and so on. Europe is a relatively thin sliver there just because of the population distribution. But you'll see from this that, and you'll notice first of all that the figure here is 25 million. That's lower than the figure I gave you of 43, and that's because these are legal abortions. So it's 43 because of the estimate of how many illegal abortions there are in other parts, and those figures are disputed. But you'll see that actually, even though the figures are still absolutely huge, the numbers are coming down in China and in the former Soviet Union. Now, why is that? Well, Russia tightened its abortion laws because there were more abortions than live births during the communist era. So as a purely pragmatic move, Putin tightened up the laws, encouraged people to have more children because he was worried about the demographic effects on the population. There were not enough, there were too many old people, not enough young people, people in the working population to support them. And in China, the situation is different. It's because of sex selection abortion, abortion of female babies, because they're not wanted or as much economic advantage, and because of the one-child policy that people tend to choose boys over girls. And it's estimated that there are 160 missing women in both China and India and Vietnam and other countries if you add them all up. And it's important to understand that that plays into other issues like human trafficking and pornography as well. Not enough women, pornography, human trafficking result from that. Now, this is a bar graph of different countries, and you'll see that the average here is that there are 105 boys born for every girl because they survive better in utero for some reason. But you'll see in the countries of China, India, and Vietnam, the big ones, the ratio is 112 boys to 100 girls are born, and that's solely because of sex selection abortion of female babies. So let's move on to artificial reproduction. And again, it's important to understand how all these issues interrelate. Why is there such a huge demand, particularly in the Western world, for artificial reproduction technologies like IVF, GIFT, gamete and fallopian transfer, and surrogacy and all of that. Why is there such a demand? Well, part of it is because of the move to delayed reproduction. People getting married later, putting off their families, having families when they're far less fertile and less likely to conceive. That's one issue. STIs, sexually transmitted infections, have a major effect, many of them, on the fallopian tubes that the eggs travel down to get to the uterus. And so blocked tubes equals infertility. And then there's also in Western countries a fall in babies available for adoption. So there's less option for childless couples. 1 in every 11 couples will be infertile. But why is the fall of babies available for adoption? Abortion is the basic reason. And in the UK, if we go back to the 1960s, there were about 30,000 adoptions every year, and it's now fallen to just a few hundred, and that's largely because of abortion, so babies are not available. How many babies are being produced by artificial reproduction? Well, it's 4, 5, possibly even 6 million babies worldwide now have been born as a result of IVF or sperm and egg donation and other things. And what we're now seeing is the growth of commercial surrogacy. So people in the rich West commissioning couples in Eastern Europe or in India or in other parts of the world to be able to carry their babies for them, and with some rather interesting court cases arising out of that. So the next area is prenatal selection. This little girl has Down syndrome, so she has an extra 21st chromosome. And in most Western countries now, between 90 and 95% of all babies detected to have Down syndrome in the womb are aborted. So 18 to 19 out of 20 of them. There are still a lot of babies with this condition being born, and that's because a lot of them are being born to mothers who are younger and therefore not being screened beforehand. But there's a progressive move to legalize testing prenatally to make sure all of them are found, and that will have inevitable results on the population of people with Down syndrome. And the new development in the last year or so is what we call cell-free DNA, and that means that you can simply take a blood sample from the mother and test it for fetal DNA from the baby that's crossed the placenta and gone into the mother's bloodstream, and then diagnose Down syndrome that way. Now, that's going to mean a much higher hit rate in terms of diagnosis. And there's a campaign currently running in the UK called Don't Screen Us Out, which is led by organisations that are advocates for children with Down syndrome. But think a little bit more about this. There are 8,000 genetic diseases. We're getting much better at testing them. It's hard to fix them. And so the way the trajectory is going is towards search and destroy rather than fix. Do you understand that? Now, how do we detect genetic abnormalities before birth? Well, it can be done in several ways. What we call chorion villus biopsy, which involves taking some cells from the neck of the womb at about 8 to 10 weeks into the pregnancy, quarter of the way through, or amniocentesis, which involves putting a needle into the amniotic fluid around the baby and then examining that for abnormalities. And then there are other tests like ultrasound and so on. But there's a whole industry now pretty much geared to search and destroy when we're talking about babies with special needs. Expect that to spread. Other technologies which we can only really just touch upon. Gene therapy is where you can actually correct an abnormal gene. Very difficult to do technically, although advances have been made, and so the priority tends to be detect the individual and abort the individual. Sex selection is where you might decide that you want a male or female baby, so you test it before birth. This couple here was a couple in the UK who had 4 boys and a girl, and the girl tragically died in a bonfire accident, and they wanted another little girl to balance their family. So they went to court for the right to be able to select a female embryo. They didn't want to run the risk of having another little boy. And save your siblings, that's when you have a child who already has some kind of blood condition or other abnormality that could be fixed by a bone marrow transplant, but you haven't got a donor, and so you have another baby that's a genetic match for your existing child who will then become the donor for that baby. So just an overview here. Stem cells, reproductive and therapeutic cloning. This is Dolly the sheep, who was the first cloned mammal ever. She died early on. It was found that parts of her body were a lot older than other parts, and that's because she derived some of her cells from a sheep which was much older. And it's possible to clone, that is, produce a genetically identical copy of an individual for most lower species, so reptiles, frogs, no problem at all, quite a few mammals, but really very, very difficult in humans technically, and no one has done it yet. Animal-human hybrids, where people are producing a cell or an embryo which is actually a hybrid of an animal and a human being. Why would they want to do that? Well, in order to produce stem cells that might be used to treat diseases where there's destruction of a certain kind of cell in the body, so things like diabetes or Parkinson's disease. Again, this is not legal in most of Europe, but in Britain, which tends to lead the way down the slippery slope, they legalized animal-human hybrids a few years ago, and the idea is that they could use cow eggs in order to produce stem cells that were human by a cloning process. It didn't work, and so we didn't hear any more about it, and it's now a footnote in history. There's a lot of work being done with stem cells. So these are primitive cells in our bodies which can develop into lots of different cell types, and there is some work being done producing embryos that are then grown to a certain stage, and then their cells are taken and harvested and grown in laboratories. There's very little in the way of any therapies that have come out of that so far. But what has been very successful is the use of what we call adult stem cells, where you take cells from existing adults or children or out of the umbilical cord to be able to produce material that can be then grafted into someone who needs it. So bone marrow transplants are a form of adult stem cell transplant, but it's now being used to treat a lot of other diseases in clinical trials too, and it seems to be where their running is. And then over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been 2 new big developments that have come on the scene. One is what we call the 3-parent embryo, where you take 2 women and 1 man and produce 1 embryo out of it. And the aim of that is to produce, to be able to help couples who carry a very rare condition called mitochondrial disease to be able to have babies that don't carry the condition. And this condition is passed on down not through the DNA in the nucleus of the cell, but through DNA in the cytoplasm or body of the cell. And so the 3-parent embryo process enables them to get around that. And again, it's very early stages in experimentation. The new thing that's burst onto the scene in the last year is what we call DNA editing. And we now have very sophisticated technology which can go in and cut out a length of DNA that's going to code for a disease or some abnormality, and then replace it with something better. And again, it's an early experimental stage. So here, we haven't got time to go into depth in any of these things, but I just want to give you an idea of the scope of conditions. And then within the whole area of bioethics as well is contraception. What contraceptives should we use? Related to that is how do they act? And we know that some contraceptives like condoms, for example, barrier methods, act by stopping egg and sperm coming together. Others of them act by preventing the ovary producing eggs in the first place. But then there's a sort of grey area in the middle with some contraceptives and intrauterine devices, coils would be in this category, which can act by stopping the implantation of an embryo that's already implanted or about to implant in the womb. And the importance of that, of course, is that if you believe human life begins at the time of fertilization, then in fact these particular contraceptives are acting really as very early abortifacients rather than contraceptives. Does that make sense? And then euthanasia. We thought that the legalization of euthanasia would happen all over the world very quickly. It's been very, very slow indeed when you consider it with other developments like same-sex marriage, which has really rocketed all around the world. But this is a state at the moment. Australia legalized it briefly in the 1990s and then criminalized it again. It was just one state in Australia. There are 3 countries, the Netherlands, Belgium and Quebec and Luxembourg, all in Europe where euthanasia or assisted suicide are both illegal. Assisted suicide is also legal in Switzerland at the moment. Quebec in Canada has just legalised it, and Canada is about to across the whole country under the Trudeau government. And then there are a handful of states in the US which have legalised assisted suicide, where a doctor helps someone to kill themselves, as opposed to euthanasia where the doctor actually gives a lethal injection. That's not legal anywhere. And there have been a huge number of attempts to legalise assisted suicide in other US states. So the key message to get here is that there's a huge amount of opposition to the legalisation of euthanasia virtually everywhere in the world. It's moving very, very slowly, although there's great efforts to change the law. And I think when we look back at the beginning of life issues, whereas abortion is legal in most of Europe at the moment, most European countries have quite tight legislation when it comes to things like embryo research and cloning. So Britain would be at the liberal end of the spectrum. So all of us are going to encounter all of these issues personally in our churches, in our legislature, if we're not already. Now, these are population pyramids, and this country is Japan here, which is not a European country, but the pattern in Europe is similar in all European countries, but not quite as dramatic. And on the left here, you've got the population pyramid from 1950 in Japan, and you'll see that 35% of the population were 15 years or under. 5% was 65 years and over, and 60% were in the 15 to 64 age group, so the working age group. And this is the kind of pattern, perhaps a little less or more exaggerated than this, that you get in most developing countries of the world at the moment. Lots of young people, very few old people. In the middle is Japan just a few years ago. Now you see there's more people in the working age group, 65%, but look how the under 15s has shrunk and the over 65s has grown. And then projecting through to 2050, we've got nearly 40% of the population 65 years or older, and just 9% less than 15. And notice also that the working population's shrunk to 50%. Now, what happens when that happens? You've got fewer people earning money to support those at both sides of the spectrum. Add into that toxic debt, unemployment, other crises, and you have a recipe for something quite serious. And it was seeing this pattern that made Putin think, okay, we've got to change the laws on abortion. And there's a chilling message here, and it's simply this, that the generation which kills its children will end up being killed by its children. Do you see that? You have a long period of legalizing abortion, you end up with a huge number of elderly people who have to be supported, and therefore the push for euthanasia gets stronger. So that's the kind of background that we're seeing of demographic change. So there's a survey on what's happening around the world. Now, ethical decision making, how we decide what's right and wrong, is becoming a lot more difficult, and it's becoming more difficult for many reasons. Firstly, we can do so much more. So at the turn of the last century, we didn't even have antibiotics, but now we have gene therapy, with ventilators, we've got nanotechnology, and so the more technology you have, you've got to ask the question, well, do we actually use it as well? Then there's a shift from what we call paternalism, doctors know best, to patient autonomy. It's the patient's choice. Of course, that brings new decision makers in. And then there's the influence of the mass media, but particularly the internet, so that anyone can Google about an illness or disease and go along to their doctor knowing more than their doctor does if it's a rare condition, although they may well have got the information from an unreliable source and lack the discernment to know where they can get good information from on the internet. There's a move to team management, so there are more health professionals involved in every decision. There's financial and resource constraints, less money to go around, so decisions have to be made about what we provide and what we don't. But the thing that's really making it more difficult is that the loss of a moral consensus. And if you go back at 200 or 300 years, you find that most people in Europe think the same about most issues. And certainly in Europe today, if you just go back 50 or 60 years, you'd find that the medical profession generally in Europe would be very conservative on the abortion issue, whether they were Christians or atheists or whatever. But now that's changed completely, and there's a huge amount of polarization on that and other issues. And the reality is that we've moved from a situation 200 or 300 years ago, before the Enlightenment, when most people in Europe had a Christian theistic worldview. So they believed in an all-powerful creator, that morality was what was taught in the Bible and was consistent with God's character, that death wasn't the end, there was an afterlife and heaven or hell depending on decisions and choices made in this life, that human beings were made in God's image to worship him, and that truth was something that we looked to God to reveal and could also discover through science, but we believed we had to do God's work God's way. And most people thought like this, whether they were born again believers or not. And of course, what has happened is we've seen a huge amount of shifts. So initially there was the Enlightenment, which began at the end of the 18th century. And then in the 19th century, two very significant things happened to undermine faith in the Christian faith. And the first was Darwin's theory of evolution, 1859, which made being an atheist intellectually respectable, because people could then account for biological complexity without God. And that was what so many people could just cut God off. And the other thing, of course, is that liberal theologians were starting to pull the New Testament to bits and ask whether it was really historically reliable. So these two factors together, along with the Enlightenment shift, led to a situation where the predominant worldview in Europe changed from one of Christian theism into atheism, into existentialism, into postmodernism, or whatever. And so now in most European countries, people think like this. We're the product of matter, chance, and time. We're clever monkeys, higher animals, and our redemption, we look to science and technology because there's nothing beyond death. And the most we can hope for in this life is life of longer length and better quality. And perhaps if we can find a way of reversing the aging process, then we might get back to the sort of ages that the patriarchs and before lived to. So that's the secular worldview that most people now hold. And of course popularized by the new atheists, of whom Richard Dawkins is one. The theory of evolution explains biological complexity, the Bible's unreliable, and more than that, the Christian God is actually immoral. He's genocidal, pestilential, and there's a whole series, aren't there, of eloquent adjectives to describe Dawkins' view of God. Now, if we go back in medical ethics and look at how doctors and health professionals have thought for the last 2,000 years, there are two very strong traditions running through that time which brought people to pretty much the same conclusion. And one was the Greek or Hippocratic tradition, beginning with the Greek doctor Hippocrates in 600 BC. And if you look at the ethics of Hippocrates, they're very similar to the Judeo-Christian ethics. Now this is one quote: "I will give no deadly medicine to anyone if asked, nor suggest such counsel, and nor in like manner will I give a woman a pessary to produce abortion." So this is 2,500 years ago. A Greek polytheist called Hippocrates was saying just this, and a whole lot of other things that we would agree with. Now, what happened in the second half of the 20th century is that ethical codes began to change because the culture was changing, as we've seen the shift from theism to atheism. This is just one example. The Declaration of Geneva says, "I'll maintain the utmost respect from the time of conception." That was drafted in 1948 after the Second World War, and it was signed up to by every national medical association in the world. Creates a problem, of course, doesn't it, when doctors are doing abortion. And so in 1983 they changed it, and they took the words "from the time of conception" out and put in "from its beginning," and beginning was left conveniently undefined. Grey area. This is another one, the International Code of Medical Ethics. A doctor must bear in mind the obligation of preserving human life from conception, 1949. Note the dates here. Why were these codes all written in the late 40s? Well, it was because of what happened during the Nazi Holocaust. It was a response to that and the fact that members of the medical profession were involved in that whole process. And you see on this one, they've just taken the words "from conception" off. So that starts a debate about, well, what is life and when does it begin? And perhaps when does it end as well? Is a person with dementia really still a human being? This is in Britain, 1947, the British Medical Association said euthanasia, suicide and abortion were the greatest crimes. It's not a Christian organisation, it was just the secular doctors. But by the year 2000, the College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists is saying abortion is a basic healthcare need. And in fact, in the last week, we've had the Royal College of Nursing in Britain, the Royal College of Midwives, whose job it is to ensure that babies are safely delivered and protected, have now come out to support abortion being completely decriminalised right up to the moment of birth. So that's the kind of shift that we've got in society. And so we've seen what we call the rise of secular bioethics. It used to be Hippocrates and the Judeo-Christian tradition which determined ethics. But over the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen the rise of secular bioethics, bioethics coming from a secular humanist perspective, growing out of the Enlightenment, if you like. And we haven't got time to trace this in great detail, but just a few threads of it. You've got Binding and Hock, who were two Germans, a lawyer and a philosopher in the 1920s, and they drafted a book in which they coined the term life unworthy of life. And Hitler actually picked that idea up and gave it practical application in the Nazi Holocaust. Watson and Crick, you might remember, are the names associated with the discovery of DNA in Cambridge in the Cavendish Laboratory. And both of them, you might not know, were advocates of infanticide for babies with special needs or disabilities. Peter Singer is an Australian philosopher now operating in the States, who is one of the leading bioethicists in the world today. And he said, it's not the sanctity of life we should be thinking about, but the quality of life. Not all human beings are the same. There are some whose lives are worth more than others. And in fact, Singer talked about speciesism. He said Christians are speciesist because they think that human beings are more important than animals. Singer argued that, no, you could have a healthy dolphin or a healthy chimpanzee that's of more value than an elderly person with dementia or a child with a disability. And so under secular bioethics, we've seen a trend to these three things: growing technology, moral relativism, and autonomy or free choice. And the way these work together, autonomy says, I want it, technology says, we can do it, and relativism says, why not? And most discussion you see now about new advances in technology follows along these lines. Well, we can do it, it's going to give us advantage, why not? Because we're operating in a post-Christian framework. Now, there are lots of different ways of making ethical decisions, and as you can imagine, there are lots of streams of philosophical thought that have fed into this whole process historically, as well as the Judeo-Christian and Hippocratic tradition as well. And just to simplify it, perhaps there are three main ways of thinking. And the first one is that we decide what's right or wrong on the basis of the consequences of the action, how it turns out at the end. So what ends well is right. The deontological view, which is pioneered by Kant, is that no, we need a set of rules about what's right and what's wrong. And then virtue ethics is the other school. And the idea behind that is that it's good people who make good decisions, so we should help people to be virtuous. And as Christians, we look at these and we'll say, well, we see traces of all these things in Scripture, and we can see an element of truth in each of them. We could perhaps come back to that later and what the deficiencies are in those. But we've reached a point where we, in a sense, in Europe, we have, on the one hand, the Christian Hippocratic tradition, which is gradually being replaced by a secular or materialist tradition. And I've tried to encapsulate it here. Under the Christian view, human beings are made in God's image. They're incredibly precious. All human life is of infinite value. And the strong should make sacrifices for the weak. That's what a humane, godly society is all about. And of course, we see that most perfectly in the person of Christ, who, although he was in the form of God, as we're looking at this morning, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself and took the form of a servant. And then contrast that with the secular materialist view that human beings are just one of many species, and the value of human life depends upon its quality. So some human beings are worth more than others in the accounting stakes. And the weak should be sacrificed for the strong. Now, of course, it was Hitler who took this to the ultimate extreme in arguing that those who were weak or less intelligent or had certain diseases should be eradicated from the population in order to make the population stronger so that it would survive better. But we've got two quite different ethics. Now, the difference in what Hitler did, of course, and what's happening today is that we have much better technology than Hitler had, and so that we can make all our assessments at a much, much earlier stage in life before birth with that technology, and we don't have to wait until people are born to do it. And so a lot of decision making tends to be driven now by economic concerns. Is it cost effective? And this is a quote from Jacques Attali, mid-90s. As soon as he goes beyond 60 to 65 years of age, man lives beyond his capacity to produce, and he costs the society a lot of money. Euthanasia will be one of the essential instruments of our future society. So this is a French politician. What's interesting about this particular guy is that, do you recognize the name, anybody? He was appointed as the governor or the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development after the Berlin Wall came down, and his job was to make loans to Central and Eastern Europe to help these countries develop in a kind of modified Marshall Plan. And he lost his job, actually, when it was discovered that he'd spent more money on the marble flooring of the London branch of the bank than he had in loans to Eastern Europe. So we have a saying in English that what goes around comes around. And so now he is, rather interestingly, a man in his late 60s, past his sell-by date. So we call this a boomerang. Something you throw it out and you turn around, it comes back and hits you on the head if you're not careful. Okay, so we've looked at what's happening with bioethical issues. We've looked at some of the background of the cultural and worldview shift in Europe and the way that's impacting on medical ethics. So back to the question of, how do we approach this from a Christian perspective? And I'm wanting to suggest that we think about it in these 4 ways of a Christ-like approach. So sharing the mind of Christ, holding to the commands of Christ, displaying the character of Christ, and then finally carrying the cross of Christ. So let me say a little bit about each of those. And you'll see here that what I'm really trying to do is to lay a framework of principles that we can then go and apply to these various issues, but we need to start from first principles. Well, what does having a Christ-like mind mean? Well, I think, first of all, it means thinking about the world in the same way that Jesus Christ did. And he had a Christian worldview, that human beings are made in the image of God, that nonetheless human beings are fallen creatures, fallen from grace, and that fall has affected every part of our bodies. It's given us physical mortality. It's made us people who choose to do sin. In fact, as sinners by nature, we are, as a result, flawed masterpieces indeed, and in need of redemption. And God's involvement in the redemption process has been through his common grace and providing things like science and technology, but most perfectly, of course, through the person of Christ, through his death and resurrection, who gives us forgiveness, new life, the gift of the Holy Spirit, and the guarantee of a life forever with him. And we look forward, unlike the secularists, not to death being the end, but being a gateway to a new heaven and a new earth. And we look forward to Christ coming back to this earth. So there's a Christian worldview. We need to think about it in these terms. So then we think, secondly, having the mind of Christ, secondly, holding the commands of Christ. And just think about some of the principles that we can apply to this area. And the first one is that of human dignity, that all human beings are incredibly precious because they're made in the image of God. The famous physician Thomas Sydenham, who was a Puritan, lived in the 17th century, used to say that human beings were incredibly precious for 2 reasons. Firstly, they were made in the image of God, but secondly, that God gave nobility to the human race by becoming a human being in the person of Christ. So both the creation and the incarnation play into that idea. There's no animal that's made in the image of God, and Jesus did not become an animal. So because human beings have dignity, we treat them with respect, with wonder as God's creations. We protect them, particularly if they're vulnerable, including legal protection, and we relate to them as fellow travelers and sufferers. There's no other religion that gives that basis. Secondly, stewardship and science. So the idea that scientific knowledge, technology are the gifts of a good God to be used to serve other human beings and to deal with the planet in a good and godly way. And of course, science can be misused, but we see science and technology as God's good gifts to explore, and Christians should be involved in them. The idea of the sanctity of life, which is the prohibition all the way throughout Scripture of the shedding of innocent blood or killing people other than in specific circumstances, under the authority of the state or in the context of war and so on. But the killing of innocent people was everywhere proscribed, forbidden. marital purity, the idea that sexual relations only take place within the context of a lifelong covenant relationship between one man and one woman. And that surely has implications for things like donor gametes, one would think, donor egg and sperm. Children, they're not a possession, but a gift given to us to care for. So the interests of the child must always be paramount as the vulnerable member of the family. Confidentiality, that we shouldn't use information we have about people in order to harm them, but rather to help them. The principles of justice and equity, the principle of end and means. This is the idea that the end doesn't justify the means. So it's not enough to have a good end. You've got to do it the right way. Now, let me give you a crass example. During the Nazi Holocaust, the Germans had a group of people they called the SS X-ray Battalion. And their aim was to eradicate TB, tuberculosis. Or you'd say eradicating TB is a very good aim. But the way they did it is they X-rayed people, and if they had TB, they shot them. You see, so it ends and means. Now, in the same way, if you're trying to help people with special needs or reduce the amount of suffering in the population, whatever's causing it, you don't do it by killing people who are suffering. And when we think about the sanctity of life in the context of life before birth, and this impacts on the embryo and abortion debates, of course, it of course raises this question of when life does begin. But if we go through Scripture, we find, first of all, a huge number of references to conception, the beginning of life. Now, the human beings who, under God's inspiration, wrote the Scriptures didn't know the amount of biology we do, but they certainly knew that life began in the womb with an event called conception. And it's astounding the number of references there are in both Old and New Testaments to life before birth. And you can think of some of the examples: Esau and Jacob wrestling in the womb, Isaiah and Jeremiah being called out of the womb, David saying in sin his mother conceived him, and so on. And then, of course, we see in the New Testament Elizabeth prophesying over Mary when Mary was in her first month of pregnancy, and John the Baptist, of course, at 6 months gestation, 2/3 of the way through, was leaping in the womb at this news. So all the way through Scripture you get this extraordinary amount of reference to life before birth. And probably the most dramatic one of all is Psalm 139, which talks about us being fearfully and wonderfully made and knit together in our mother's womb, and saying that even before we were born, God knew us, David looking back at his life. And that affirms for us God's creation of life in the womb, also the continuity of life before and after birth. So David's looking back and saying, that was me back there. And also God's communion with us even before we were aware of our own existence. So there's a very strong scriptural tradition here. We'll perhaps come back to that in the interest of time. But so we've got the mind of Christ, thinking in terms of a Christian worldview. We've got holding the commands of Christ, walking in obedience to his commands. And then the third one here is the Christ-like character. And we see this all through the New Testament about be imitators of God, be imitators of Christ. He says, anyone who says he belongs to Christ, says John, should walk in the way that Jesus walked. And so when we're saved and we come into his kingdom, he gives us a new nature, he gives us the gift of the Holy Spirit, and he expects us to live godly lives, to live lives of daily repentance and faith and obedience. And as we walk with him, then our characters and natures are gradually transformed into people who can do what pleases God. We exhibit more and more of the fruit of the Spirit. And the reason this is so important is because if you think about really, really difficult ethical decisions, about a person with a very painful terminal illness who's got only weeks or days to live, or a child that's been conceived with a very severe abnormality, or a difficult abortion situation where the mother's health might be in danger, whatever, or a family who are plagued with a condition like mitochondrial disease and are looking for cures. It's difficult enough to think through from the principles about how they apply and what's right and wrong in that situation. But when you've done that, you've still got the situation that it takes an extraordinary amount of grace, courage, character, fortitude to be able to do the right thing. And so Plato was right about this, that virtue is very important in making good decisions. And then finally, carrying Christ's cross as well. This is one of my favorite pictures of the crucifixion. It's Salvador Dali's St. John of the Cross. And the reason I love this picture so much is it's not a horrible contorted Christ. It's this muscular Christ who has decided to be there and is looking down on the world that he loves because he's deeply engaged with it and giving himself for it. And I think carrying the cross, when we come to the area of bioethics, involves two things. I think, first of all, it involves being the compassionate solution to difficult situations. And I put John 8, 1 to 11 there, but you remember that's the story of the woman caught in adultery. And of course, she was caught in the act, but only the woman came, so they were hypocritical to start with. But you remember Jesus was the only one there who could have condemned her or thrown the first stone, but he decided not to. He forgave her, and then he went and died on the cross to pay the price for her sins. We don't know whether that woman ever came to faith, but we know that his death was sufficient for her to be forgiven. So Jesus had an option between the first way of throwing the stone and condemning, the second way of just letting her off, but he chose the third way, which was the costly way of forgiveness, with him bearing the cost of it. Now, how does that apply to decisions in medical ethics? Well, I think what it means is that we have to be prepared as God's people to take on the difficult third way. Now, if you think of the issue of abortion, there is, either this woman has a baby she can't care for, or she has an abortion. That's how the thing's put to us. No, there's actually a third way, which involves good antenatal care, support, possibly financial help, maybe adoption, walking with people through the situation. In the same way, think about euthanasia. Either this person has a lethal injection, or we let them die in the most terrible, painful way. No, there's a third way, but it's very costly. It involves good palliative care, the best medical treatment available, being with a person, dealing not just with their physical needs, but their psychological, spiritual, and social needs as well. And it's costly in terms of money, it's costly in terms of time, it's costly in terms of emotion, and it may well be costly also in terms of training, because to become the kind of person who can provide those solutions takes a long time in the health professions. But it's that kind of third way that I think is part of carrying the cross. But I think the other part of carrying the cross is being willing to stand up and speak on behalf of those who have no voice. Whether it's unborn children, elderly people with dementia, children with Down syndrome, or some other abnormality, that we are called to be a voice for the voiceless. Why is that carrying the cross? Because there will be people who don't like it when we speak out, and we will invite all sorts of criticism and attack in doing it. So there we are, a Christ-like having the mind of Christ, holding the commands of Christ, taking the character of Christ and carrying the cross of Christ.